During World War II, the U.S. played a remarkable role in the Pacific. The United States Navy became one of the dominant forces in the Pacific. The construction of new aircraft carriers and battleships allowed the country to show more power in the sea. To know how powerful the U.S. Navy was, let's dive into Pacific Showdown, Decoding the U.S. Navy's World War II Might. Brace yourself. The U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers were a game changer during the war. It contributed to the U.S. becoming one of the dominant forces at that time. During the beginning of the World War, the U.S. Navy only had 7 fleet carriers and 1 auxiliary escort aircraft. But by the time of September 2, 1945, when the war was ending, 112 carriers were in control of the U.S. Navy. 11 of them were lost in the war, but the other 101 aircraft carriers played a significant role, which eventually contributed to the U.S.'s defeat of Japan. Now let's take a look at what all were the powerful aircraft carriers that helped the U.S. to mark the victory in World War II. Number 1. Lexington-class fleet carrier. This fleet carrier consisted of 2 36,000-ton aircraft carriers. It was converted from a battle cruiser in the 1920s because of the Washington Naval Treaty. These were the largest U.S. carriers designed before and during World War II. These 2 ships were identifiable by their large smokestacks on the starboard. Lexington was lost in May 1942 in the Battle of the Coral Sea, but Saratoga fought throughout the Pacific War with an active service. She survived the Pacific War. After that, she became a nuclear test subject. She was built so strong that she withstood the first nuclear attack, but she sank after the second nuclear bombing. Number 2. Yorktown-class fleet carrier. This was the first modern carrier for the U.S. Navy, and the most modern going into World War II. The Yorktown class consisted of 2 19,500-ton ships. This was ordered in 1934 and 1935 respectively. It was made in the design in which this fleet carrier covered all the deficiencies of the larger fleet carrier. The main feature of this carrier was a combined design of the island and the smokestack. After the exhaust of the time limit of the treaties, a 3rd ship, Hornet, was ordered. This was one of the best designs that the U.S. Navy had. All 3 ships were thrown into many notable attacks against Japan. Hornet was lost in the Battle of Santa Cruz in October. The Yorktown and Lexicon class suffered most of the damage caused by the Japanese until new carriers came into combat. Number 3. Wasp fleet carrier. It was a single ship class that was designed in 1935 as a product of the Washington Naval Treaty limitations. It was a 14,700-ton carrier laid down in 1936. So many modern features were added to the carrier after noticing the deficiencies of the Ranger. It had the first ever deck edge elevator. However, the Wasp also was a flawed vessel with very few protection features. When the intensity of the war was increased, the Wasp was also sent to the Pacific Ocean. She was attacked and sunk by the Japanese forces. Number 4. Independent-class light carrier. The Essex was not expected to be in service until 1944. The war was getting intensified, and the U.S. wanted more carriers. The immediate solution was to produce smaller, converted aircraft carriers. 9 independent-class light carriers were constructed to help supplement the U.S. fleet in the Pacific. They featured a small air group. Their main feature was their ability to maintain a speed similar to fleet carriers. The carrier was not supposed to have an island, but an island was made effective. It featured minimal armor and flight deck protection, and boasted only medium to short-range anti-aircraft weaponry. The carriers were around 14,000 tons. Princeton was the only loss of this kind of carrier. It sunk in the Battle of the Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Number 5. Charger-class escort carrier. It was one of the 4 Avenger-class Royal Navy escort carriers. It was similar to Long Island. It also had a small island structure. The 4 ships were exclusively built for the Royal Navy, and it was launched in 1941. The Charger-class escort carrier was first in the Royal Navy, and in October 1941, she was taken back to the U.S. Navy. It was used as a training ship for British pilots during the war. She was the only Charger-class escort carrier in the eyes of the U.S. Naval Force. Number 6. Bogu-class escort carrier. It was made to fit in the shoes with the shortcomings of the Long Island conversion. The Bogues had an adequate air group. It also features a catapult to make the launch of aircraft easier for a smaller deck. It had deficiencies and lacked underwater protection systems. This Bogue-class escort carrier had issues in rough seas. The visual features included a small island. One ship was lost due to an attack, and it was the only aircraft carrier that the U.S. Navy lost in the Atlantic during the war. It was a great success, and there were mass production of these escort carrier class. Number 7. Sangamon-class escort carrier. In 1942, 4 Cimarron-class fleet oilers were converted into the Sangamon-class escort carriers. It was one of the most effective escort carrier conversions. It had a larger and longer flight deck compared to other escort carriers. It was more stable since it was lower in the water. They have highly efficient hangars and fuel facilities. The air group was also larger. There were 4 carriers in total. One of them was in the Atlantic, and the other 4 served in the Pacific. Number 8. Casablanca-class escort carrier. It was the first escort carrier designed based on a merchant hull. It was based on the S-4 merchant class hull. It had 2 aircraft elevators and a larger deck. There was a lack of proper protection. It faced one of the most powerful fleets of Japan and put the U.S. Navy on top. Number 9. Commencement Bay-class escort carrier. It was the modern escort carrier. The Navy wanted it throughout the war. Only 3 of the carriers saw combat before the end of the war. Number 10. Wolverine 964 and Sable 981. These were freshwater-side, paddle-wielded aircraft carriers. It was in use on Lake Michigan. It was used for pilot training and qualifications. Both of them were decommissioned and scrapped after the war. Number 11. Ranger Fleet Carrier. It is the first designed and built keel-up aircraft for the U.S. Naval Force. These had prominent visual features. This fleet carrier came into service in 1934. This also had 6 hinged exhaust sacks that could be rotated parallel to the flight in any flight operation. However, this aircraft fleet carrier had many deficiencies. Some of it was the lack of underwater protection and propulsion speed for a fleet carrier. This aircraft carrier served on the Atlantic as a ferry carrier because of its deficiencies. Because of the deficiencies, these fleet carrier was not able to play a direct role in the Pacific Sea during the war. This played an active role in Operation Torch, the Allied North African landings, with the aircraft attacking 5th French ground forces and naval targets. The last role she played was against German shipping in October 1943. After that, she was sent back to the U.S. as a training carrier and eventually became the night training carrier in the Pacific. She was removed from service after the war in 1947. Number 12. Essex-class fleet carrier. It was the modern U.S. fleet carrier design in the World War II. It was built with the main goal of creating a larger air group. It also featured a larger flight deck edge elevator for better flight operations. 17 of these aircraft carriers were built and commissioned before World War II, while 14 would see active participation in the conflict. The main feature was the visual features compared to the other fleet carriers. It also has a smaller island structure and smokestack combination along with the 4 twin 5-inch 38 caliber guns on the flight deck. The SA was broken into 2 subclass designs. They are the short hull and the long hull Essex. The short hull ships had an overall length of 872 feet, while the long hull ship had an overall length of 888 feet. But they had the same waterline length. Among the 17 ships which were commissioned to build, 7 of them were long hull types. These carriers played a crucial role in the victory. The Franklin and Bunker Hill were almost lost because of the damages caused to it. Number 13. Long Island-class escort carriers, based on a C3 type merchant hull. The first escort carrier conversion took place in March 1941. The Long Island had a flight deck extending most of the vessel. It also had a single aircraft elevator and aircraft catapult. She had no island structure. This carrier was the only carrier to participate in the battle without one island. It was 13,500 tons. It was used as a test subject to test whether modern flight operations can be done using a short flight deck. Wasn't this an exciting journey? If you enjoyed this, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more historical insights.